Fog rolls in. Secrets hide where footsteps fade. Welcome to Marsh Shadow Files. I am your host, Lucien. This community keeps growing. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Your messages always bring the mystery to life. Now, let's begin. The October fog had begun its evening descent upon the Cotswolds with that peculiar stealth which transforms familiar landscapes into something altogether more mysterious. Bellingham Conservatory, a Georgian mansion of mellowed stone and graceful proportions, stood with composed dignity against the gathering mist, its tall windows glowing with warm electric light that seemed to float suspended in the grey void. The formal gardens, so precisely maintained during daylight hours, had dissolved into mere suggestions of topiary and gravel paths, while the ancient oaks that guarded the estate loomed like ghostly sentinels in the thickening air. Inspector Roderick Allen paused in the entrance hall, removing his driving gloves with the unhurried precision of a man accustomed to observing details others might overlook. The invitation had come through his wife Troy, who had been commissioned to paint a portrait of Helena Vance, one of the conservatory's most promising young violinists. Now, as he waited for his hostess to appear, Allen found himself studying the portraits that lined the panelled walls, distinguished alumni whose painted eyes seemed to follow him with the particular intensity reserved for those who had achieved artistic immortality. The air held that distinctive mixture of beeswax polish, old timber, and the faint, almost ethereal scent of rosin that clung to any establishment devoted to the musical arts. From somewhere in the building's depths came the sound of scales being practiced with mechanical precision, punctuated by the occasional correction from a piano. The fog pressed closer against the leaded windows, muffling the world beyond and creating an atmosphere of intimate isolation that seemed to concentrate the mind upon the drama about to unfold within these walls. Inspector Allen, how perfectly delightful that you could join. Thus, Lady Millicent Bellingham descended the curved staircase with the measured grace of one who had spent decades commanding attention through presence rather than volume. She was a woman of perhaps 65, her silver hair arranged with architectural precision, her evening dress of deep burgundy velvet suggesting both wealth and an unwillingness to acknowledge the passage of time. Her greeting carried that particular blend of compliment and condescension which Allen recognized as the hallmark of a certain class of English hostess. Troy has spoken so warmly of your appreciation for the musical arts, though I confess I had not expected Scotland Yard to produce such a cultured specimen. Allen inclined his head with diplomatic courtesy. You're most kind, Lady Bellingham. I fear my appreciation exceeds my knowledge, but enthusiasm must sometimes compensate for expertise. Indeed it must, she replied, though her smile suggested she found such compensation rather inadequate. As they moved toward the drawing-room, Allen became aware of voices engaged in conversation that possessed the particular cadence of cultural discourse, measured, precise, and laden with the weight of informed opinion. The drawing-room itself presented a tableau of refined society, cream silk wallpaper, crystal chandeliers casting pools of amber light, and perhaps 30 guests whose evening dress created an elegant composition against the room's understated luxury. Through the tall windows, now completely obscured by fog, one could sense rather than see the world beyond retreating into grey anonymity. Maestro Torretti, Lady Bellingham called to a distinguished gentleman whose silver hair and erect bearing proclaimed his profession as clearly as a uniform. I should like you to meet Inspector Allen. His wife is painting Helena's portrait. The maestro turned, revealing dark eyes that seemed to assess Helene with the same intensity he might bring to evaluating a new orchestra member. The fortunate husband of the artist, Torretti said, his slight Italian accent lending warmth to words that might otherwise have seemed merely polite. Your wife has captured something quite remarkable in Miss Vance, a quality that suggests depths yet to be explored. Before Allen could respond, a sharp voice cut through the ambient conversation, like a blade through silk. Depths, maestro? Or merely the carefully cultivated mystery that young performers believe passes for artistry? The speaker was a woman of middle years, her angular features made more severe by steel-rimmed spectacles and an expression of perpetual dissatisfaction. She moved through the gathering with the confidence of one whose opinions carried weight, though not necessarily affection. Lady Bellingham's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Inspector, may I present Miss Evelyn Ashford, whose reviews in the Musical Quarterly are required reading for anyone serious about the contemporary scene." Aline studied the critic with interest, noting the way other guests seemed to unconsciously create space around her, as if her capacity for devastating judgment might prove contagious. Miss Ashford acknowledged the introduction with a nod that managed to be both gracious and dismissive, her attention already returning to Maestro Toretti with the focused intensity of a cat watching a mouse. "Miss Ashford fears that our students confuse technique with temperament," Toretti said, his tone carefully neutral, though his hands, Aline noticed, had formed themselves into small, precise fists. "I maintain that true artistry requires both discipline and the courage to reveal one's authentic self." "Authentic self," Miss Ashford repeated, her voice carrying a note of amused skepticism. "How charmingly romantic, Maestro, though I wonder if your definition of authenticity extends to acknowledging one's limitations as readily as one's gifts." The exchange carried an undercurrent of tension that suggested a history of professional disagreement, though both speakers maintained the veneer of civilized discourse. Around them, other conversations continued in the subdued tones appropriate to cultural gatherings, but Aline sensed an almost theatrical quality to the evening's proceedings, as if each participant were conscious of playing a role in some larger drama. The fog had now completely enveloped the conservatory, transforming it into a closed world where every glance and gesture carried heightened significance. As a gong sounded from the corridor with well-bred authority, announcing the beginning of the evening's performances, Aline found himself wondering what harmonies and discords the night would reveal. Beneath the polished surface of artistic endeavor, the concert hall at Bellingham Conservatory possessed that particular acoustic perfection, which seemed to amplify not merely sound, but the subtlest nuances of human emotion. The room had been transformed for the evening's gala, with exquisite attention to ceremonial detail. Rows of gilt chairs upholstered in deep blue velvet, arranged with mathematical precision, while wall sconces, their silk shades casting pools of amber light, created an atmosphere of intimate grandeur. The great windows along the south wall had surrendered entirely to the advancing fog, which pressed against the leaded glass like grey velvet curtains drawn by an invisible hand. Within this enclosed world, the scent of beeswax and old leather mingled with the faint sweetness of hothouse lilies, arranged beneath a portrait of the late Lord Bellingham in his dress uniform, his painted eyes seeming to survey the evening's proceedings with benevolent authority. Inspector Allen had positioned himself in the third row, a vantage point that afforded him clear observation, not only of the small stage where a Steinway grand piano waited in solitary splendor, but also of the audience whose reactions might prove as illuminating as the performances themselves. The evening's first offering, a Baroque trio performed by 3 earnest students, had established the proper tone of refined appreciation, earning the correct measure of applause from patrons who understood their role in this cultural ritual. When Helena Vance took her place upon the stage, violin in hand, the atmosphere seemed to concentrate itself around her slender figure. She was a young woman of perhaps 22, her fair hair arranged with becoming simplicity, her pale blue gown suggesting both modesty and an unconscious awareness of her own attractions. Her performance of Bach's Partita No. 2 demonstrated technical mastery of the highest order, each note placed with crystalline precision. Yet Allen found himself conscious of something held in reserve, as if she were protecting some essential part of herself from the scrutiny of critical assessment. The music flowed with mathematical perfection, but beneath its surface lay depths that remained carefully unexplored. From the wings, partially concealed by the heavy stage curtains, a young man watched with the focused intensity of a predator, studying its prey. David Moorcock possessed the lean, ascetic features often associated with serious musicians, his dark eyes never leaving Helena's graceful form as she navigated the intricate passages of the partita. When the final notes faded into the reverent silence that follows truly accomplished performance, his hands moved in a brief, unconscious gesture of applause before he caught himself and withdrew further into the shadows. The interval brought its own form of performance as the company flowed into the adjacent drawing room, where a fire glowed in the marble grate, and footmen moved with practiced discretion among small islands of conversation, their silver trays bearing crystal glasses of pale sherry and delicate refreshments. The fog had now completely enveloped the conservatory, transforming it into a world unto itself, cut off from all external reference points and concentrating the mind upon the drama unfolding within these walls. Lady Millicent Bellingham stood near the fireplace, her burgundy velvet catching the warm glow of the flames as she prepared to address her gathered patrons. When she spoke, her voice carried with that particular authority which comes from generations of command, yet Alan detected beneath its polished surface a note of steel that suggested decisions already made and resistance anticipated. "My dear friends," she began, her smile maintaining its gracious warmth, while her eyes surveyed the room with calculating precision. "You know better than most that art must be nourished, but circumstances oblige us to re-examine the manner in which we provide that nourishment. The scholarship program, our chief expression of public-spirited patronage, will be restructured. Merit must be balanced by sustainability." The announcement created ripples of carefully concealed anxiety among the listeners, like stones dropped into still water. Hallin observed how faces maintained their expressions of polite interest, while eyes betrayed more complex calculations. A young faculty member's hand tightened imperceptibly upon his glass. Two students exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their suddenly uncertain futures, and Maestro Toretti's jaw set in a line that suggested both understanding and profound disagreement with the policy being announced. "Surely, Lady Bellingham," ventured Professor Whitmore, a thin gentleman whose prematurely grey hair spoke of years spent in academic pursuit, "artistic merit should transcend mere financial considerations." "Artistic merit, Professor, requires financial foundation," she replied with the crisp precision of one accustomed to having the final word. "We must ensure that our resources support those most likely to justify our investment." From across the room, Miss Evelyn Ashford's voice cut through the ambient conversation with its characteristic edge of authority. "Investment, Lady Bellingham? How refreshingly candid, though I wonder if your evaluation criteria extend beyond technical proficiency to include that rather more elusive quality we call artistic integrity." The critic had positioned herself near a display of programs documenting the conservatory's distinguished history, her steel-rimmed spectacles reflecting the firelight as she surveyed the gathering with what appeared to be professional assessment. Maestro Toretti approached with 2 glasses of sherry, offering one to Miss Ashford with courtly precision that barely concealed his tension. "Miss Ashford raises a pertinent point," he said, his slight Italian accent lending warmth to words that carried their own subtle challenge. "Technical excellence without emotional authenticity produces mere mechanical reproduction, not art." "Indeed, Maestro," Ashford replied, accepting the glass with a nod that might have been acknowledgement or dismissal. "Though I confess myself curious about your own definition of authenticity, particularly as it applies to your more recent protégé." The exchange carried undertones that suggested a history of professional disagreement, though both speakers maintained the veneer of civilized discourse. Alan found himself studying the dynamics of this cultural microcosm, noting how conversations seemed to circle around certain subjects without quite addressing them directly, like dancers performing an elaborate minuet whose steps everyone knew but whose purpose remained deliberately obscure. When the bell summoned them back to the concert hall, Marcus Whitfield took his place at the piano with an air of barely suppressed defiance. He was a young man of perhaps 25, his dark hair arranged with studied casualness, his evening dress impeccable, yet somehow suggesting a costume donned for purposes of his own. His chosen piece, a modern composition whose dissonant harmonies challenged conventional expectation, was performed with technical brilliance and deliberate provocation, his fingers attacking the keys with a force that seemed designed to disturb rather than please. The older patrons shifted uncomfortably during the more aggressive passages, while the younger members of the audience exchanged glances of practiced daring. As the final jarring chord faded into silence, the applause that followed carried that particular quality of polite appreciation tinged with uncertainty, as if the audience were unsure whether they had witnessed artistic courage or mere youthful rebellion. Whitfield's bow contained a note of triumph, his dark eyes scanning the faces before him as if seeking specific reactions among the sea of carefully composed expressions. When the evening concluded and guests began their ritual expressions of appreciation, Alan noticed how the fog had transformed the conservatory's long corridors into something resembling the passages of a ship becalmed in grey waters. In the backstage area, a footman passed with a tea service, the silver pot steaming faintly in the subdued light, and Alan heard Miss Ashford's voice, crisp, decisive, addressing someone he could not see. "Yes, the library will suit me perfectly." Later, when the crowd has dispersed, as he made his way toward the entrance hall, Alan paused beside the door to the music library, which stood fractionally ajar despite the lateness of the hour. From within came a draught that carried the scent of leather bindings and aged paper, along with something else. A faint, sweet fragrance that seemed oddly out of place in a room devoted to scholarly pursuits. The fog pressed closer against the windows, and somewhere in the building's depths, a clock chimed the quarter hour with measured solemnity, its sound seeming to hang in the air like a question waiting to be answered. The morning light arrived at Bellingham Conservatory, with the hesitant quality of one who intrudes upon private grief. The fog had thinned to wisps of grey silk that clung to the ancient oaks and Georgian stonework, though it still pressed against the tall windows with ghostly persistence. Within the mansion's corridors, the echoes of the previous evening's elegance seemed to linger like the memory of applause, while the scent of beeswax and old leather spoke of a world temporarily suspended between celebration and tragedy. Mrs. Gable, the head housemaid whose 30 years of service had taught her to move through the conservatory's rooms with silent efficiency, discovered the body at precisely 7 o'clock. The music library, that sanctuary of scholarly pursuit with its floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound scores and theoretical treatises, had been transformed into something far more sinister. Miss Evelyn Ashford sat slumped over the broadwood piano, her steel-rimmed spectacles askew, her grey hair dishevelled in a manner that would have horrified her in life. Her right hand rested upon the keys as if she had been attempting to play when death claimed her, while scattered sheets of manuscript paper lay about the piano bench like fallen autumn leaves. Inspector Allain arrived within the hour, summoned by Lady Bellingham's telephone call that had carried beneath its measured tones an unmistakable note of distress. He entered the library with that careful attention to detail which had served him throughout his career, immediately noting the position of the body, the arrangement of objects and something else, a faint, sweet fragrance that seemed to hover in the air like an unwelcome guest. It was not the familiar scent of leather bindings or aged paper, but something more organic, almost floral, yet with an underlying note that suggested corruption beneath beauty. Dr. Pembroke, the local physician who served as the conservatory's medical advisor, straightened from his preliminary examination with the grave expression of one who had encountered death in circumstances that defied natural explanation. "Inspector Allen," he said, removing his spectacles to polish them with methodical precision, "I'm afraid we have something rather more complex than natural causes. The facial expression and positioning suggest poisoning, though I cannot determine the exact agent without proper analysis. The symptoms indicate something that acts upon the nervous system, possibly a plant alkaloid." Lady Bellingham stood in the doorway, her morning dress of dark blue wool suggesting a woman who had abandoned sleep in favor of confronting crisis. Her customary composure remained intact, though Allen noted the slight tremor in her hands as she surveyed the scene. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying that particular control which comes from years of managing difficult situations, "I cannot express my shock at this terrible occurrence. Miss Ashford was a distinguished guest, and her loss represents not merely personal tragedy, but a significant blow to musical scholarship." Allen approached the piano with reverent care, observing how the sheet music, a Bach invention, had been scattered by what might have been convulsive movement. Upon a small table beside the instrument sat an elegant tea service, a delicate spode pot with its floral pattern of roses and forget-me-nots, and a single cup containing only the dregs of what appeared to be ordinary tea. Yet that persistent sweet scent lingered about the service, something that reminded him of almonds, though he could not be entirely certain. "Has anyone else been in this room since the discovery?" he inquired, his trained eye cataloguing every detail while his mind began transforming observed facts into investigative hypotheses. Mrs. Gable, whose competent bearing spoke of decades managing institutional domestic arrangements, twisted her hands in her apron. "No one, Inspector. I found her at 7 precisely. I always begin my rounds in the library to ensure proper security after evening use. The door was unlocked, which struck me as unusual, as Miss Ashford was most particular about securing the room when she worked late." As Allen continued his examination, his attention was drawn to a detail previously overlooked, a second teacup, partially concealed behind a stack of musical scores on a nearby shelf. This cup was clean and dry, as if prepared for use but never employed, or perhaps hastily rinsed and replaced. The discovery suggested that Miss Ashford might not have been alone during her final hours, transforming what might have been accidental poisoning into something far more deliberate. "Dr. Pembroke," Allen said, turning to the physician, "the sweet scent you mentioned, might it indicate a masking agent designed to conceal a more bitter taste?" The doctor considered his words carefully. "Quite possibly, Inspector. Many plant alkaloids possess distinctly unpleasant flavors that would require concealment if administered in food or drink." From the corridor came the measured footsteps of Sergeant Fox, whose reliable presence brought the comfort of professional competence. Behind him followed the local constabulary, their boots respectful upon the turkey carpet as they awaited instructions. The fog continued to press against the library windows, and somewhere in the building's depths, a piano began the measured progression of scales, as if life were attempting to reassert normal rhythms despite death's presence. Yet the sound seemed hollow in the grey morning light, and Allen found himself studying the manuscript papers scattered about the floor. Notes and observations in Ashford's precise script, draft reviews of the previous evening's performances, though the handwriting became increasingly erratic toward the bottom of each sheet. The evidence suggested a meeting planned and executed with careful deliberation. The sweet scent and second teacup, speaking of hospitality, offered and fatally received. As he prepared to begin the formal investigation, Allen reflected upon the tragic irony that a place dedicated to creating beauty had become the setting for such calculated destruction. The fog swirled past the windows like grey curtains drawn by an invisible hand, and in that muffled atmosphere he sensed the presence of secrets yet to be revealed, discordant notes waiting to disturb the harmony of this supposedly refined world. The conservatory's administrative office had been transformed into an unlikely theatre of investigation, its mahogany paneling and leather-bound ledgers creating an atmosphere of scholarly authority that seemed at odds with the grim business at hand. It was a long, high-ceilinged room where generations of institutional decisions had been made, the air redolent with the particular mixture of beeswax polish, aged paper, and ink that spoke of decades devoted to careful record-keeping. A coal fire worked discreetly in the grate, lending warmth to the October morning and casting a gentle glow upon the framed photographs of distinguished alumni that gazed down from the mantelpiece with silent dignity. The tall sash windows, no longer obscured by fog, revealed formal gardens where autumn light played among carefully tended paths, though within these walls the atmosphere remained charged with unspoken tensions. Inspector Allen had arranged the furniture with theatrical precision, positioning chairs to encourage confidence while maintaining the social proprieties that govern discourse among the educated classes. Sergeant Fox occupied his customary corner with notebook ready, his reliable presence providing the comfort of professional competence as they prepared to navigate the complex relationships that bound this musical community together. Lady Millicent Bellingham entered with the measured composure of one accustomed to managing institutional crises, though Allen noted the slight pallor beneath her carefully applied cosmetics and the manner in which her hands sought unconscious occupation with her pearl necklace. She settled into the indicated chair with graceful precision, arranging her dark blue wool skirt with attention to propriety that remained intact, despite circumstances that defied conventional social navigation. "Inspector," she began, her voice carrying that particular control which comes from decades of committee meetings and charitable functions, "I confess myself utterly bewildered by this tragedy. Miss Ashford was certainly a woman of strong opinions, but the notion that anyone might harbor sufficient animosity to contemplate such dreadful action seems quite beyond comprehension." Harlequin studied her with gentle persistence, noting how her eyes avoided direct contact when she spoke of the victim. "Lady Bellingham, you mentioned yesterday evening your intention to restructure the scholarship program. Might Miss Ashford's critical assessments have complicated your efforts to maintain patronage?" The question struck home with visible effect, though Lady Bellingham's composure remained intact. Miss Ashford understood the delicate relationship between artistic excellence and public support, she replied, her tone suggesting careful preparation. However, she occasionally expressed her opinions with a vigor that some patrons found discouraging. The Pemberton family, for instance, withdrew their considerable annual contribution following her rather savage assessment of their daughter's recital last spring. Such incidents create practical difficulties that extend far beyond mere critical discourse. A gentle knock announced the arrival of Maestro Torretti, whose distinguished bearing could not entirely conceal the anxiety that shadowed his dark eyes. He entered with measured grace, yet his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he accepted the chair Alain offered. The morning light revealed silver threads in his carefully groomed hair and lines of tension about his mouth that suggested sleepless hours spent contemplating unwelcome possibilities. "Maestro," Allen began with diplomatic courtesy, "your relationship with Miss Ashford appears to have been professionally complex. The artistic community is small, and disagreements tend to become personal. Might you elaborate upon the nature of your differences?" Torretti's response carried passionate eloquence, though beneath its surface lay currents of barely controlled emotion. "Inspector, Miss Ashford represented everything that corrupts true artistic endeavor. She wielded her critical authority like a weapon, destroying young talents before they could develop the confidence necessary for genuine expression. Her reviews were exercises in intellectual cruelty, disguised as scholarly assessment." His accent lent warmth to words that carried their own subtle challenge. To shape sound from air requires exposure more intimate than undressing. Some critics understand this vulnerability. Others prefer to wield the pins. Yet she continued to be welcomed at conservatory functions, Alain observed, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes registered every nuance of the maestro's reaction. "Institutional diplomacy requires accommodation of diverse perspectives," Lady Bellingham interjected, her voice carrying steel beneath its polished surface. Miss Ashford's reviews, however severe, were based upon rigorous standards that ultimately served the cause of musical excellence. The exchange revealed tensions that extended beyond mere professional disagreement, suggesting personal animosities carefully concealed beneath the veneer of institutional courtesy. Alan found himself studying the dynamics between his subjects, noting how their conversation seemed to circle around certain subjects without quite addressing them directly. Helena Vance entered upon invitation with the particular grace that distinguished her performances, though her pale complexion and the slight tremor in her hands suggested composure maintained through considerable effort. She wore a simple morning dress of grey wool that emphasized her youth, while according proper respect to the gravity of circumstances. Her fair hair arranged with becoming simplicity, though her fingers moved unconsciously to adjust invisible imperfections. "Miss Vance," Alan said gently, recognizing the particular vulnerability of youth, confronted with adult complexities. "I understand that Miss Ashford had reviewed your performances on several occasions. The artistic world can be unforgiving of perceived failures. Might you describe the nature of those assessments?" The young woman's response emerged with careful precision, as if she had rehearsed her words during sleepless hours. "Miss Ashford's review of my debut recital was comprehensive in its criticism. She suggested that technical proficiency, without emotional authenticity, produces merely mechanical reproduction, not art." The assessment appeared in 3 separate publications and effectively ended several opportunities that had been under consideration. "That must have been deeply disappointing," Alan observed, his tone carrying genuine sympathy, while his mind catalogued the implications of professional destruction. "Disappointing hardly encompasses the experience, Inspector," Helena replied, her composure cracking slightly to reveal the pain beneath. "Miss Ashford possessed the authority to determine which careers flourished and which withered before they could properly begin. Her disapproval carried consequences that extended far beyond mere critical assessment. It took months to recover the confidence necessary to perform again." Marcus Whitfield entered with the restless energy of one who finds stillness intolerable, his evening bravado having thinned considerably in the harsh light of morning. The handsome features were too set, the mouth too ready to form retorts, and he declined the offered refreshment with unnecessary decisiveness before settling into his chair with something approaching defiance. "Mr. Whitfield," Alan began, "your performance last evening was unconventional. Miss Ashford was known for her conservative tastes. Did you have occasion to discuss your artistic choices with her?" "Ashford hated anything that wasn't strictly conventional, anything with genuine fire to it," Whitfield declared, his dark eyes meeting Elaine's with challenging intensity. "She called my composition a vulgar display of unbridled ego, and suggested I observe silence as a compositional element. I informed her that silence had been overused by lesser minds. After the concert concluded, where did you go?" Whitfield's answers became vague, his explanations containing suspicious gaps that he attempted to fill with increasing agitation. "I walked the grounds, needed air after the performance. The fog was thick, excellent for clearing one's head. I smoke when troubled, Inspector, though I trust you won't hold that against me. Did you encounter Miss Ashford during these nocturnal wanderings?" "I did not. I had no desire to be corrected before breakfast." As the morning's interviews concluded, Alan remained by the tall windows, studying not the gardens beyond, but the faint reflection of the room within the glass. The portrait of Evelyn Ashford that emerged from these careful conversations revealed a woman who had wielded critical authority with surgical precision, creating enemies through the exercise of professional judgment while maintaining the protection afforded by institutional necessity. Each conversation had added another layer to the complex web of resentments and fears that surrounded the victim, suggesting motives that extended far beyond simple artistic disagreement. From somewhere in the building's depths came the sound of scales being practiced with mechanical precision, and Alian found himself studying a detail that had previously escaped notice. A program from the previous evening's gala, found among the papers on the desk, bore pencil marks in the margins, small crosses and notations that seemed to correspond not with performances, but with the intervals between them. The markings suggested a mind that planned with meticulous care, timing movements to coincide with moments when attention would be elsewhere. As the office clock chose that moment to hesitate between beats before recovering with a faintly apologetic whir, Alan reflected that even the most carefully orchestrated performances could contain small discordances that revealed the human hand behind the apparent perfection. The conservatory's formal gardens emerged from the retreating fog like a watercolor painting slowly gaining definition, their Georgian precision softened by autumn's gentle decay and the morning light that filtered through ancient oaks with cathedral solemnity. Beyond the carefully maintained parterre, where gravel paths wound with mathematical precision between beds of late roses and fading herbaceous borders, lay the wilder precincts, where ornamental design surrendered to nature's more anarchic impulses. Here, beneath spreading branches that created pools of dappled shadow, foxgloves grew in magnificent profusion, their tall spires of purple bells nodding with deceptive grace in the gentle breeze that had finally dispersed the previous night's concealing mist. Inspector, Alan moved through these neglected spaces with Sergeant Fox, their footsteps muffled by fallen leaves that released the rich, earthy scent of autumn decay. Dr. Pembroke's telephone call had confirmed his suspicions with clinical precision. Miss Evelyn Ashford had died from digitalis poisoning, the deadly alkaloid extracted from the very flowers that surrounded them in such abundant display. The physician's report had been thorough in its detail, noting the characteristic cardiac irregularities and gastric distress that spoke of careful dosage rather than accidental ingestion, suggesting a hand guided by both knowledge and malicious intent. Foxglove grows wild throughout these grounds, Fox observed, his practical mind already cataloguing the implications of such ready availability. Anyone with basic botanical knowledge could have prepared the extract, though it would require considerable skill to achieve the proper concentration without detection. Their methodical search revealed evidence of recent disturbance. Among the foxglove stands broken stems and disturbed earth that spoke of hurried gathering in conditions of poor visibility. Beside a particularly magnificent cluster, they discovered an overturned wire trug, its willow ribs stained with damp green, and nearby a fragment of greaseproof paper that bore traces of crushed plant matter releasing when bruised, a bitter odor that seemed to tighten the very air. Their investigation was interrupted by the appearance of James Hartwell, the conservatory's former groundskeeper, whose dismissal 3 months earlier had created one of those institutional awkwardnesses that polite society preferred to ignore. He emerged from behind a tool shed with the measured dignity of one who had spent decades maintaining other people's gardens, his weathered hands still bearing the ingrained soil that marked his profession, despite his current unemployment. "Inspector," he said, touching his cap with old-fashioned courtesy, while his eyes surveyed the neglected beds with professional disapproval. "I heard about the terrible business with Miss Ashford. Shocking thing to happen in a place like this, though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. That woman had a way of making enemies, sharp tongue and no consideration for those she thought beneath her notice." Elaine studied the man with interest, noting the bitter undertone beneath his respectful manner. "Mr. Hartwell, you were employed here for many years before your recent departure. Might you elaborate upon your lack of surprise?" The former groundskeeper's response carried the particular resentment of one who had been dismissed without adequate cause. She complained about my work to Lady Bellingham, said the practice rooms needed better soundproofing, and blamed the garden noise for disturbing her precious concentration. 30 years of service, and I was let go because some critic couldn't tolerate the sound of honest labor. Though I suppose these educated types might need specific instruction about foxglove preparation. Any person knows it's poisonous. The revelation added another layer to the complex web of resentment surrounding the victim, though Alan noted that Hartwell's grievance seemed directed more toward institutional injustice than personal malice. His knowledge of botanical properties, however, could not be dismissed as irrelevant to their investigation. Returning to the conservatory's domestic quarters, Alan sought out Mrs. Pemberton, the cook whose substantial figure and formidable efficiency had managed the institution's culinary arrangements for over a decade. Her kitchen, a gleaming expanse of copper pots and scrubbed wooden surfaces, smelled invitingly of roasting meat and freshly baked bread, creating an atmosphere of domestic comfort that seemed at odds with their grim purpose. "Mrs. Pemberton," Alan began, adopting his most reassuring tone, "we understand that Miss Ashford often took tea when working late. Might you describe the circumstances of last evening's preparation?" The cook's response revealed institutional routines that had operated with clockwork precision until disrupted by tragedy. "Miss Ashford was most particular about her tea, Inspector. Always a strong Darjeeling, no milk, 2 sugars, but last evening she specified that she might have a visitor and requested a second cup. Said someone wished to discuss a professional matter and preferred the privacy of the library to the public rooms." Her eyes held a momentary flicker of something unspoken, a hint of knowledge she felt was not hers to share. She seemed pleased about the appointment, said it concerned artistic standards and professional responsibility. This revelation transformed the investigation's focus from random opportunity to planned meeting, suggesting premeditation rather than impulse. "Did Miss Ashford mention the identity of her expected visitor?" "No, Inspector, though I thought it might be one of the faculty members seeking her advice about student assessments. I prepared the service around 10:30 and had it sent to the library pantry, as she preferred to pour it herself." In the library's small pantry, Alan discovered a study in domestic exactitude, slightly compromised by haste. The narrow dresser bore a service of spode with its familiar floral pattern, beside which stood a brown earthenware teapot, whose spout bore stains darker than the body. Most significantly, among the fine china sat a plain white saucer from a utilitarian set, bearing the faint ring where a cup had stood and been removed, leaving its ghost behind in tea's continued presence. Sergeant Fox lifted the brass kettle, noting the faint scum that indicated recent use, while Alan examined the teapot's interior, detecting beneath the ordinary tea a floral sweetness that suggested something added to mask bitterness. "There is our sweetness," he said quietly. "Not sugar alone, but something designed to persuade a bitter infusion to pass muster." As they prepared to leave, a faint draught stirred the dishcloth upon its hook, exposing upon its hem a pale green smear that had not been there the day before. The discovery completed a picture of careful preparation and calculated execution, transforming their understanding of the crime from spontaneous violence to methodical murder. The investigation had revealed not merely the means of death, but the deliberate planning that had made it possible. Yet the identity of the killer remained as elusive as the morning fog that had finally lifted, leaving behind only the certainty that someone within this refined community had used their knowledge of both human nature and botanical science to eliminate a woman whose critical authority had become intolerable. From the direction of the main building came the sound of piano practice, scales and arpeggios that seemed to mock their grim investigation with reminders of the institution's noble purpose, while somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour with measured solemnity, its sound carrying across the countryside like a reminder that even in places dedicated to creating beauty, The darker aspects of human nature could not be entirely excluded. Miss Ashford's guest chamber occupied the eastern wing of Bellingham Conservatory, with the particular dignity reserved for rooms that serve temporary but distinguished occupancy. The morning light, filtered through chintz curtains patterned with faded roses, revealed a space that wore its respectability like a well-pressed evening dress, correct in every detail, yet somehow suggesting depths beneath its proper surface. A writing desk positioned beneath tall windows bore the implements of scholarly industry, a portable typewriter in its leather case, bottles of India ink arranged with mathematical precision, and a brass lamp with a green shade that gathered illumination into a disciplined pool. The turkey carpet muffled footsteps to a civilized whisper, while the coal fire worked discreetly in the small grate, lending warmth to what might otherwise have seemed an austere sanctuary. Inspector Allen moved through the room with reverent care, conscious that he was disturbing not merely the possessions of the deceased but the carefully constructed edifice of a life devoted to the systematic collection of human weakness. Sergeant Fox had positioned himself near the wardrobe, his reliable presence providing the comfort of professional competence as they prepared to unravel secrets that would have scandalized the conservatory's refined patrons. The air still held faint traces of lavender water and the metallic scent of ink, creating an atmosphere that spoke of industry pursued in solitude. Lady Millicent Bellingham had accompanied them with evident reluctance, her morning dress of navy wool suggesting a woman who maintained proper standards, despite circumstances that defied conventional social navigation. She stood near the doorway with practiced composure, though her hands betrayed tension as they sought unconscious occupation with her pearl necklace. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying that particular control which comes from decades of managing institutional crises, "I confess myself deeply uncomfortable with this intrusion upon a guest's privacy, yet I understand the necessity of your investigation." Professor Whitmore arrived shortly thereafter, his prematurely grey hair more dishevelled than usual, and his hands trembling slightly as he surveyed the room where so many of his colleagues' secrets had been catalogued. The academic's bearing spoke of sleepless hours spent contemplating unwelcome possibilities, while his eyes avoided direct contact with the evidence that Alain was methodically arranging upon the writing desk. The desk's central drawer yielded a marbled folder secured with green ribbon, which Alain undid with the same courtesy he might have shown to a troublesome witness. Within, papers had been arranged with librarian precision, drafts of reviews bearing the victim's characteristic surgical prose, correspondence with publishers and editors whose letterheads spoke of cultural authority, and most significantly, a series of financial records that transformed their understanding of Miss Ashford's relationship with the musical community from professional criticism to systematic extortion. Bank receipts documented regular deposits of substantial sums, each accompanied by coded notations that corresponded, Alain quickly realized, to individuals they had already interviewed. The amounts were significant enough to supplement a critic's modest income considerably, while the regularity of transactions spoke of relationships maintained through mutual understanding rather than mere professional courtesy. Letters from anxious parents seeking favorable reviews for their children, detailed notes about plagiarized compositions and falsified credentials, and photographs documenting indiscretions that would have destroyed carefully cultivated reputations, created a portrait of a woman who had transformed critical authority into an instrument of extraordinary power. "Professor Whitmore," Alain said with diplomatic courtesy, noting how the academic's eyes avoided the correspondence spread before them, "Miss Ashford appears to have maintained extensive files regarding the authenticity of various musical manuscripts. Your expertise in such matters would have been invaluable to her scholarly pursuits." The professor's response emerged with careful precision, as if he had rehearsed his words during those sleepless hours. Miss Ashford occasionally sought verification of attributions and compositional techniques. The musical world requires such scholarly collaboration. Inspector, though I confess myself shocked by the apparent scope of her documentation, among the most disturbing discoveries was a draft manuscript titled Harmonies and Discords, Truth Behind the Musical Establishment, which promised to expose what Ashford termed the systematic corruption of artistic standards through financial manipulation and personal compromise. The document outlined specific cases of purchased reviews, falsified credentials, and inappropriate relationships, naming individuals whose reputations would have been destroyed by such revelations. The manuscript suggested that Miss Ashford had been preparing to transform years of discreet blackmail into public scandal, elevating her private leverage into published authority. Lady Bellingham's composure remained intact as she observed the evidence, though the afternoon's revelations had clearly tested her institutional diplomacy. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying steel beneath its polished surface, "to discover that a distinguished guest had been collecting information in this manner represents a betrayal of hospitality that I find quite incomprehensible. The institution's reputation depends upon maintaining confidence among our patrons, and Miss Ashford's methods created an atmosphere of anxiety that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Yet among all these professional machinations, Alan discovered a small silver-framed photograph that spoke to different aspects of the victim's character. It showed a younger Evelyn Ashford, perhaps 20 years earlier, standing beside a distinguished gentleman, both holding violins with expressions of genuine artistic joy. The inscription on the reverse, written in delicate script, read, "With dearest Arthur, after our performance at Wigmore Hall, 1928, the photograph provided a glimpse into a life perhaps once driven by genuine love of music, before bitterness and the systematic exploitation of human weakness had transformed artistic passion into professional weaponry. As the afternoon light faded and shadows lengthened across the turkey carpet, Alan reflected upon the complex web of dependencies that Miss Ashford had created through her methodical collection of secrets. Each piece of correspondence revealed another individual whose future had been held hostage to her critical authority, while the financial records suggested an operation conducted with business-like efficiency over an extended period. Most troubling was a letter from an unnamed correspondent, dated only days before the fatal evening, which spoke of final arrangements and the necessity of decisive action to preserve institutional integrity. The handwriting was educated but disguised, the paper expensive but unremarkable, and the tone suggested someone who had moved beyond mere resentment to active planning. Yet among all the carefully maintained files, Alan noted one conspicuous absence. Despite clear evidence of professional conflict, no correspondence or notes relating to Maestro Toretti appeared anywhere in Miss Ashford's meticulous documentation. From somewhere in the building's depths came the sound of evening practice, scales and arpeggios that seemed to mock their grim investigation with reminders of the institution's noble purpose. As Alain prepared to secure the evidence, the omission regarding the maestro struck him as deliberate rather than accidental, suggesting that someone had been selective in determining which secrets would survive to be discovered. The library clock chose that moment to chime the hour with measured solemnity, its sound seeming to hang in the air like a question waiting to be answered. While outside the tall windows, evening mist began to gather among the ancient oaks, as if the conservatory were once again preparing to conceal its truths beneath a veil of grey uncertainty. The conservatory had fallen into that particular hush which belongs to late afternoon in autumn, when practice rooms murmur with distant scales, and the corridors hold the golden dust of fading light like amber preserving moments in suspension. Outside the tall windows, mist had begun its evening gathering among the ancient oaks, though it moved with less urgency than on the fatal night. drifting like grey silk scarves through branches that seemed to welcome its concealing embrace. The air carried that mixture of wood smoke and fallen leaves, which spoke of seasons turning, while from somewhere in the building's depths came the methodical progression of a Bach invention, its mathematical precision creating an oddly comforting counterpoint to the investigation's more troubling harmonies. Inspector Allen had arranged these final conversations with theatrical precision, understanding that approaching resolution required not merely the accumulation of evidence, but the careful orchestration of psychological revelation. He found Helena Vance in the conservatory's glasshouse, where exotic ferns thrived in humid warmth and the scent of hothouse blossoms mingled with damp earth. She sat upon a wrought iron bench amidst a profusion of orchids, her fair hair catching the last vestiges of daylight, her hands clasped with the particular tension of one who had spent sleepless hours contemplating unwelcome possibilities. "Miss Vance," Alain began gently, recognizing the vulnerability of youth, confronted with adult complexities. "The world of musical criticism can exact a terrible price from those who seek to create beauty." Miss Ashford's influence extended far beyond mere professional assessment. "Might you describe the full extent of her authority over your career?" Helena's response emerged with careful precision, each word chosen as deliberately as notes in a challenging passage. "Inspector, Miss Ashford possessed an extraordinary capacity to dissect a performance, to expose every perceived flaw with surgical precision. Her words had a way of lodging themselves within one's artistic consciousness, making it nearly impossible to perform without their echo." A faint flush touched her cheekbones as she continued. "After her review of my debut, I could not play for months without feeling that someone had tuned my strings too tight. She wrote to me afterwards quite kindly, advising a course of study I could not possibly have afforded. It was an odd kindness, one that presumed obligations I had not offered." As they walked through the conservatory's upper corridors, Helena revealed details that transformed Alain's understanding of the fatal evening. "She asked me very distinctly to see her after the gala ended. She spoke of matters of standards and guardianship, upon which, as a promising alumna, I ought to be enlightened. I went as far as the corridor outside the library and found myself absurdly incapable. There were voices within, hers and a gentleman's whom I could not identify from a few murmurs. I went away, but not before hearing her speak of final arrangements and institutional preservation." In a second-floor practice room, Marcus Whitfield presided over a Steinway, with the restless energy of one who finds stillness intolerable. The room bore the marks of intensive use. A square rug worn pale where feet had worked the pedals, horsehair parting along chair seams, and a vase of tired dahlias whose melancholy seemed to echo the occupant's mood. He greeted Allen with assurance that slightly missed its target, his dark eyes holding that mixture of defiance and desperation which marked those whose carefully constructed facades were crumbling under pressure. "Inspector," Whitfield said, his fingers moving restlessly across the keys, "one is advised to treat shock with industry. Though I confess the treatment proves rather inadequate when one's entire future hangs in the balance." His voice carried the bitter undertone of one who had discovered that artistic talent provided insufficient protection against economic reality. "Miss Ashford made it quite clear that my continued presence here depended upon her discretion regarding certain accommodations I had been forced to make. She possessed correspondence that would have destroyed not only my reputation, but my relationship with Lady Bellingham, whose support represents the difference between artistic development and complete professional ruin." The revelation added another layer to their understanding of the victim's systematic exploitation. Yet Allen sensed undercurrents that suggested coordination rather than individual desperation. When pressed about his movements after the gala, Whitfield's answers became vague, his explanations containing suspicious gaps that he attempted to fill with increasing agitation. Maestro Toretti's studio, reflected the organized disorder of serious work. Scores in careful stacks, a conductor's stand with its baton laid upon a folded handkerchief, and the lingering scent of tobacco and varnished wood. The maestro stood by the window with his hands behind his back, as if presenting himself for inspection by an invisible tribunal. When he spoke, his voice carried passionate eloquence, though beneath its surface lay currents of barely controlled emotion. "Inspector, Miss Ashford represented everything that corrupts genuine artistic endeavor," he said, his slight Italian accent lending warmth to words that carried their own subtle challenge. "She used her critical authority to destroy young talents before they could develop the confidence necessary for authentic expression. We must protect the soul of such places from those who would transform art into mere commodity." His hands betrayed a slight tremor as he continued. "Institutions appear solid as stone, but they are threads woven and held by confidence. One unravels a little knot, and everything goes." When Elaine inquired about collaboration in this protection, Toretti's response was carefully measured. "A figure of speech, Inspector. The faithful, those who care about preserving what matters most." As evening deepened and mist began to gather more thickly outside the tall windows, Alan reflected upon the patterns emerging from these conversations. Each individual had spoken of Miss Ashford's destructive power, with the particular intensity of those who had suffered systematic exploitation, yet beneath their individual grievances lay something that suggested coordination rather than mere coincidence. The language they used, guardianship, custodianship, institutional preservation, seemed carefully chosen, as if they shared a vocabulary developed through mutual understanding. From somewhere in the building's depths came the sound of a metronome ticking with mechanical precision, keeping time for no visible performer. As Alan moved toward the sound, it ceased abruptly as if a finger had reached in to still it. He opened the practice room door to find it empty, save for a program from the fatal evening's gala, its margins marked with the same neat crosses he had noted elsewhere, the pencil still upon the page. In the gathering fog at the corridor's end, a figure paused, turned its head as if to measure what he had observed, and slipped away without sound. The investigation had revealed not merely individual motives for murder, but a community united in its determination to preserve something precious from systematic destruction. Though the identity of the hand that had administered the fatal dose remained as elusive as the mist that once again embraced the conservatory's ancient stones. The conservatory's administrative office had acquired the particular stillness that belongs to spaces where important decisions await their moment of revelation. Evening light filtered through tall windows with the golden quality of autumn afternoons, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where Inspector Allen had arranged his evidence with the methodical precision of a conductor preparing a complex score. The coal fire worked quietly in the grate, its warmth creating an atmosphere of deceptive comfort, while portraits of distinguished alumni gazed down from the walls with expressions that seemed to anticipate the exposure of uncomfortable truths. The air held that familiar mixture of beeswax polish and aged leather, though tonight it would witness the convergence of careful observation and logical deduction. Sergeant Fox occupied his customary position near the window, his reliable presence providing the comfort of professional competence as they prepared to demonstrate how methodical investigation could illuminate even the most carefully concealed crimes. Upon the desk, arranged with theatrical precision, lay the accumulated fragments of their inquiry. Correspondence revealing systematic blackmail, botanical evidence of deliberate poisoning, and most significantly, a program from the fatal evening whose marginal annotations had begun to reveal their true significance. Mrs. Gable entered with her characteristic discretion, carrying a leather-bound ledger that documented the conservatory's evening routines with institutional thoroughness. "Inspector," she said, settling the volume upon the desk with reverent care, "I've brought the duty roster for the gala evening, along with our record of room usage and key assignments. We maintain such documentation during formal functions to ensure proper security. Alan studied the ledger's precise entries with growing interest, noting how they corresponded to the cryptic markings scattered throughout the program's margins. What had initially appeared to be casual annotations, small crosses beside performers' names, numerical notations during intervals, question marks at seemingly random moments, revealed themselves under careful analysis to be a precisely coded timeline that exploited the evening's scheduled distractions and the concealing fog. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his finger tracing a particular entry. "This notation indicates that the library's pantry received its second tea service at 10:10 precisely. Who would have possessed such detailed knowledge of Miss Ashford's habits?" The housekeeper's response carried the weight of decades spent observing institutional dynamics. "Miss Ashford was most particular about her requirements, Inspector. She always requested her evening refreshment at the same time, and always specified that she preferred to pour it herself. Anyone who had worked here for any length of time would have known her routine, though few would have understood its significance for planning purposes." Professor Whitmore arrived at Alan's summons, his scholarly bearing unable to conceal the anxiety that had shadowed his features since the investigation began. When shown the annotated program, his academic expertise proved invaluable in deciphering the marking's true meaning. "These symbols follow musical notation conventions," he observed, adjusting his spectacles to examine the pencil work more closely. "The crosses indicate precise timing points, while these crescents appear to mark moments of maximum audience engagement, periods when movement through the corridors would pass unobserved." The revelation transformed Alan's understanding of the crime from opportunistic violence to carefully orchestrated performance. The killer had not merely taken advantage of the fog's concealment, but had planned their movements to coincide with specific moments when attention would be elsewhere, using intimate knowledge of both the conservatory's layout and the evening's schedule to ensure their actions would remain undetected. Most damning was the discovery of a second program, found tucked behind a loose board in the library's wainscoting, which bore additional notations in the same educated hand. This document revealed the true scope of the planning involved: detailed timing for the poison's preparation, precise calculations of dosage based on the victim's weight and probable consumption, and contingency plans for various scenarios that might arise during execution. The handwriting analysis proved particularly revealing. While the annotations had been disguised with careful precision, certain characteristic formations, the particular curl of the letter G, the distinctive cross of the T, matched samples from faculty memoranda and program notes that Alan had collected during his investigation. The evidence pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of musical notation, institutional routines, and botanical science, combined with the authority to move freely through the conservatory spaces without arousing suspicion. As Alan studied the timeline reconstruction, he began to appreciate the psychological complexity of the crime. This was not murder born of simple revenge or financial desperation, though such motives certainly existed within the conservatory's competitive atmosphere. Rather, it represented a calculated attempt to preserve what the killer perceived as artistic integrity, threatened by systematic corruption. Miss Ashford's critical authority had been transformed from professional assessment into personal weapon, and someone had decided that such abuse could no longer be tolerated. The fog had begun to gather outside the tall windows, and from somewhere in the building's depths came the sound of evening practice, scales and arpeggios that seemed to provide a musical counterpoint to their grim investigation. As Alan prepared his notes for the final confrontation, he reflected upon the tragic irony that a place dedicated to creating harmony had become the setting for such carefully calculated discord. The program lay open before him, its penciled annotations now revealing their terrible significance as the score for a performance that had ended in death. Yet one crucial element remained, identifying the hand that had wielded the conductor's baton in this deadly symphony. The evidence pointed toward resolution, though the final movement of this investigation would require confronting someone whose love of music had been twisted into justification for murder. The library clock chose that moment to chime the hour with measured solemnity, its sound seeming to announce that the time for revelation had finally arrived. The concert hall at Bellingham Conservatory had been transformed into a theatre of final judgment, its familiar elegance now serving a purpose far removed from musical performance. Evening light filtered through the tall windows with the particular clarity that follows the lifting of concealment, illuminating the gilt chairs and velvet upholstery with an almost surgical precision. The fog that had shrouded the fatal evening had finally retreated, drawing back like grey curtains to reveal a stage where truth would at last be performed. The air held that mixture of beeswax polish and aged leather which spoke of institutional dignity, though tonight it would witness the exposure of secrets that had festered beneath the conservatory's refined surface. Inspector Allen stood beside the Steinway grand piano with the composed authority of a conductor preparing to guide his orchestra through the most complex and tragic of scores. Sergeant Fox occupied his customary position near the wall, his reliable presence providing the comfort of professional competence as they prepared to demonstrate how methodical investigation could illuminate even the most carefully concealed crimes. The principal figures of their investigation had arranged themselves with that instinctive understanding of hierarchy which governs such gatherings. Lady Millicent Bellingham in the front row, her customary composure intact, though her hands betrayed tension as they sought unconscious occupation with her pearl necklace. Helena Vance and Marcus Whitfield maintaining careful distance from one another in the second row. Professor Whitmore positioned with academic propriety beside a pilaster, his scholarly bearing unable to conceal the anxiety that had shadowed his features throughout their inquiry. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elaine began, his voice carrying with that particular authority which transforms ordinary speech into dramatic revelation, "we gather to examine a crime that was orchestrated with the same precision and attention to detail that characterizes the finest musical performances. Miss Evelyn Ashford died not from random violence or sudden passion, but from a carefully planned execution that exploited both her personal habits and the institutional routines that governed this establishment." He moved to the evidence table with theatrical precision, lifting the annotated program whose penciled markings had revealed their deadly significance. This document represents not casual notes taken during an evening's entertainment, but a meticulously crafted timeline that coordinated the murderer's movements with the gala's scheduled distractions. Each cross marks a moment when attention would be elsewhere. Each notation corresponds to intervals when movement through corridors would pass unobserved. The killer used intimate knowledge of Miss Ashford's habits, the conservatory's layout, and the concealing properties of that evening's fog to ensure their actions would remain undetected. A gentle sound announced the arrival of Maestro Giovanni Torretti, who entered with the measured grace that had characterized his distinguished career, though his bearing could not entirely conceal the resignation that had settled upon his features like a shroud. He took his place among the assembled company with the dignity of one who understands that performance has reached its final movement, his dark eyes meeting Elaine's with something approaching relief. "The poison was prepared with botanical knowledge and administered with surgical precision," Elaine continued, his tone remaining courteous despite the gravity of his accusations. "Digitalis extracted from the conservatory's own foxgloves, carefully concentrated to ensure swift action, then disguised with honey to mask its bitter taste. The timing was calculated to coincide with Miss Ashford's customary late-night tea, administered during a meeting that she believed concerned professional consultation regarding institutional standards. Lady Bellingham's voice carried steel beneath its polished surface as she spoke. "Inspector, surely you cannot suggest that someone within our community, someone we have trusted with the artistic development of young minds, could contemplate such calculated deception?" Alan's response carried the weight of careful investigation and psychological insight. "Miss Ashford's files contained evidence of systematic blackmail, Lady Bellingham. She had transformed critical authority into personal weapon, collecting secrets and using them to maintain her position of power. Yet among all her carefully documented exploitation, one significant omission stood out. Despite clear evidence of professional conflict, there was no record of any leverage over Maestro Torretti. This absence was not accidental. It was deliberate concealment of the most devastating secret of all. The inspector's gaze settled upon the maestro with gentle but inexorable authority. Miss Ashford had discovered what some colleagues suspected, but none dared voice, that Giovanni Torretti, despite his distinguished reputation and decades of brilliant conducting, had never learned to read musical notation. His artistry, however genuine, was based entirely upon memorization, intuitive understanding, and the extraordinary craft of musical reproduction through ear alone. The revelation struck the assembled company like a discordant chord, creating ripples of shock that disturbed the room's careful composure. Helena Vance's hand flew to her throat, while Marcus Whitfield's restless energy stilled completely. Professor Whitmore's academic precision seemed momentarily suspended by the magnitude of such professional deception. The confession, when it came, emerged with the dignity that had marked all of Torretti's performances. "Inspector Alain speaks truthfully," he said, his slight Italian accent lending warmth to words that carried their own tragic weight. "I came to music through the heart and the ear, not through academic study. In my youth in a small Italian town, such formal knowledge seemed unnecessary. I could hear what others required notation to understand. By the time I recognized my limitation, my reputation had been established, and the deception became necessary to preserve not merely my career, but the respect of those who trusted my guidance. His hands, which had conducted countless performances with grace and authority, now formed themselves into small, precise fists as he continued. Miss Ashford discovered my secret through careful observation and cruel testing. She threatened to expose me unless I supported her planned book that would have destroyed numerous careers, while elevating her own authority. She had transformed criticism from artistic guidance into personal weapon, and I could no longer tolerate the knowledge that this institution was being corrupted by her presence. Alain's voice remained gentle as he completed the reconstruction. The maestro used his intimate knowledge of the conservatory's routines to plan his movements with the same precision he brought to musical interpretation. The annotated program served as his score, timing each action to coincide with moments when attention would be elsewhere. The poison, prepared from foxgloves in the conservatory's own gardens, was administered in Miss Ashford's customary tea during a meeting she believed concerned professional consultation. The fog provided perfect concealment, while the fears and secrets of others created a smokescreen of suspicion that nearly obscured the true perpetrator. As Sergeant Fox moved forward with quiet efficiency, Torretti rose with composed dignity, his bearing remaining erect despite the circumstances. "I express no regret for removing someone who had poisoned the atmosphere of artistic endeavor," he said, his voice carrying passionate conviction despite his defeat. Miss Ashford used her authority to destroy rather than nurture, to feed upon weakness rather than encourage strength. Institutions like this must be protected from those who would transform art into mere commodity, beauty into business, and inspiration into intimidation. Lady Bellingham rose with the measured authority of one who had spent decades managing institutional crises. Though her voice carried new understanding, of the complexities that had been concealed beneath their refined surface. "Maestro," she said quietly, "your love of music was never in question. Your contribution to this institution, to our students, to the preservation of artistic excellence, these remain untainted by the deception that circumstances forced upon you." The conservatory fell silent as the small procession departed, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps upon marble and the faint scent of autumn air drifting through opened windows. From somewhere in the building's depths came the tentative sound of scales being practiced, as if life were attempting to reassert normal rhythms despite the tragedy that had shattered this refined world. The fog had lifted completely, allowing clear light to illuminate the scene. Though the revelation brought no sense of triumph, only the melancholy recognition that even places dedicated to creating beauty could not entirely exclude the darker aspects of human nature. Inspector Allen remained beside the piano as the others departed, reflecting upon the tragic irony that someone whose genuine love of music had inspired generations of students had been driven to murder by the very passion that defined his existence. Upon the music stand, a sheet of manuscript paper bore a single penciled notation in an unknown hand: "Sempre," always. It was no confession, merely an instruction, yet it hung there like a reminder that institutions, once retuned, must strain to find their pitch again, and that even truth once spoken requires practice to be properly heard. The investigation had concluded, but the music would continue, carrying within its harmonies both the beauty that Toretti had sought to preserve and the melancholy knowledge that even the noblest intentions could lead to the most calculated actions. In the gathering dusk, the conservatory stood revealed not as a sanctuary immune to human weakness, but as a place where the pursuit of artistic excellence, when threatened by systematic corruption, had produced its own tragic symphony of deception, desperation, and ultimately death.